Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 22 of Aimless Ramblings. And today we are going to tackle the interesting topic of violence. Now, to start off with, I'm going to talk about the idea of words as violence. Now, this is something that has become quite prominent within the last 10 years, particularly within anti-prejudice training, anti-racism movements, but also writ largely in movements that are seeking to minimize harm, particularly against marginalized communities. And one of the things that is discussed in this side of the debate is they talk about the idea of harmful speech and hate speech. And that's really where words as violence and words as harm comes out of. So it's sort of on a two-layered approach. So I'll talk about, first of all, is the idea of like words as inciting violence. And I suppose this is something that goes back to, John Stuart Mill and that real argument for freedom of speech, but within limits. The idea, you have the freedom of speech, but not the freedom to say fire in a crowded theatre. Or as I think John Stuart Mill says, you have the freedom to criticize corn growers from causing a monopoly in corn and artificially inflating prices, but you can't say this is a polemic outside the corn grower's house as an angry mob with pitchforks and torches are standing there ready to burn it down. So it's context sensitive, but it's also it's about not directly causing harm with your words. And one of the interesting things, I suppose, from this line of thinking in anti-racism and other movements which are seeking to minimize harm in marginalized communities is that they point to the specific harm or harmful outcomes in terms of when someone uses racist or otherwise prejudiced speech towards a minority community. And I think a lot of the arguments that have been used is it's not just about, I think as one Australian politician said, the right to be a bigot. It's the idea that if I say certain things, there is actually not just negative potential social consequences or, incitement to violence, but I actually cause physical harm to this individual. For instance, I might cause harm to their mental health. And then, there's a direct link between psychological phenomena and their expression in physiological sense, such as stress, increased risk of, diabetes, etc. Like these are things that have been raised, but, it's an interesting point because I think when you start talking about words as violence and not just words as incitement to violence, it really brings the fundamental underpinnings of freedom of speech into question. And so I would throw to both of you, firstly, do you think this is a valid argument in the sense that because words can have psychological and in some cases like flow on physiological effects, we can categorize certain types of hate speech or violent speech as violent speech, which causes harms to individuals? And secondly, do you think either if we do or we don't, it doesn't matter either way, because if we do, we undermine the principles of freedom of speech, and in doing so, we might actually throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And I'll throw first to the person with the hand up.
Hi. As with everything, as you already mentioned before, it's all about context. And personally, what I think is it's about keeping that balance, because in a lot of cases, this sort of hate speech and bigotry is from a majority stake in the society to a minority. And that's where the issue occurs, because the minority, there isn't enough counter-narrative to be able to counteract it. And as such, that becomes a majority of the general knowledge of that particular group is the hate speech, is the whatnot. So it's not even a case of freedom of speech, which, is a big deal. Is that being a balanced representation of that individual or that group or that like element of society? And I think that's where I sort of sit. But Sam, you want to say something?
So you think, Simon, that it can't really be hate speech then if it's done by a different question I was going to go with, but you think it can't be hate speech when it comes from a minority? Is that right?
I believe that it is a different form, but in the case of violence, direct from thing. So the inciting of violence, I feel like that is specific to whether there is a counter narrative.
Yeah. So I honestly agree with, like, if you've got, say the Jews in Nazi Germany, to go straight back to, is it Poe's law, I think, they did not have the narrative on their side. So I'd agree that there was the incite to violence because they were such a small minority. But I don't know if I would say that just because you're a minority means that the things you do or say can't cause harm. I'd agree that, like, probably on a societal scale, obviously the biggest portion is going to have the biggest voice, but and one other thing I'll add on before I throw it back to you guys is where do we draw the line between, if one heterosexual white male to another heterosexual white male says, you're fucking stupid, you're a useless person, you've failed to achieve anything in your life, you are pathetic. Is that hate speech or is that violence? Just because it's, it's one from arguably the most privileged class in society to the most other privileged class in society, they're on equal footings. But I mean, I'd argue that can still be violence. Thoughts? I'll just jump to Simon first and then I guess we'll follow up with Tim.
As with everything, I think it goes from macro to micro. So from a macro scale, we can go, it's white male, yada, 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 that's the group. But then you go on the micro level of what do they represent within that social dynamic. And as such, there's probably going to be some form of disparity, regardless of if you have two people. As always, they say, like, when, you put enough peas in a pod, something's going to rise to the top. And that's what I sort of would see, that, like, rather than being on a macro level, there's still a minority inverted comma element or a disadvantaged element in that conversation. Anyway, I'll throw to you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Simon. So its abuse goes down only ever because I guess, if someone who is worse off than I am such, tries to give me shit, I'm going to be like, well, you're a fucking idiot. Have you seen your life? So yeah, really good point there, Simon. Tim, what's your thoughts?
I agree kind of with both of you in a sense. Like, so I definitely think Sam's raised a really important point. So if we're talking about speech as violence, and I suppose even as categorization of violence is in some ways political, like any form of speech which is then perceived as harmful by the recipient party could be construed as a form of violence, and that can be completely divorced of the intention or even the words of the sayer. For instance, if someone was to misperceive me as saying a racial slur but saw me in a position of power, they could then internalize that as, themselves being discriminated against, a broader reflection of a discriminative society, and that might have negative psychological consequences, even though I might not have said anything like it to begin with. I think still currently under investigation in the US is a US professor who said a word in Chinese while speaking, about a particular thing in terms of Chinese studies, which sounds in English similar to a slur for black people, and is currently under investigation for that. So it's an interesting one. But I also agree with Simon, I suppose, in the sense that depending on how that person internalizes their surroundings, and how, and I mean, overwhelmingly, that's going to be associated with their socioeconomic and, racial class and other statuses, the impact of it can be worse. But I suppose an interesting question here is, right, so we talk about victim narratives in broader society. So, someone who has internalized the narratives of the Great Replacement, white genocide, etc., has spent way too much time on, 8chan or whatever, reading, neo-Nazi conspiracies, potentially the psychological harm for them from someone just saying something innocuous about multiculturalism could exist, even though they exist in a privileged society. Do you think that's a valid argument, or do you think that someone's internal psychometrics or psychic state shouldn't be necessarily influential with regards to their actual socioeconomic standing? I'll throw to Sam first.
I mean, I guess harm is harm at the end of the day. I mean, I find it very awkward to be empathizing or sympathizing with neo-Nazis. But, if someone takes an action that causes them harm, then they have received harm from it. whether, I guess maybe then we have to accept a degree of harm in order to participate in society. Otherwise we are all just perfectly isolated and in our own narrative agreement echo chambers. So in order to be able to discuss ideas, then you have to be able, like, for instance, this doesn't reflect my opinion. I'm just putting an example out. So say, if I say, look, no, we shouldn't perform surgery on people with body dysmorphia, it's transsexual people. We should instead invest the money towards trying to find a way to cure their mental illness or something. That is a statement that would definitely cause harm to people, but I think people should still be able to have this conversation in society. I guess as long as, they're not coming from a standpoint of hate, maybe we have to be able to take this statement with the intent or something. I don't know, I'm rambling. Simon?
As with everything, it comes back to a balance. So if, for example, we're having this discussion and we had all members of the spectrum being discussed, I feel like that would be a conversation that could be had. The issue happens when you have something along the lines which this usually comes more to a gendered style. So, for example, when we're talking about, whether should the pill be, utilized or whatnot, when you have an imbalance in who's represented in that, in most cases, it's 90% males because they're the ones that have the stock holding in a lot of the chemical companies that are creating this kind of stuff, and they get to make those decisions. So it's all about keeping that balance. But yeah, definitely when it, as the intellectual titans, a comedian once said, you have a right to be insulted. That doesn't mean I have to care. So let's break that down. So pretty much what it's saying is, yes, the neo-Nazi has the perfect right to feel insulted that, there's multiculturalism, but that doesn't mean that there has to be a necessary societal, response to that. It can just be like, okay, cool, you're insulted by that. Is that actually something that is that society should be going, oh, shit, we need to fix this? Or is that something going, okay, cool, that's the litmus test? Anyway, somebody want to respond to that?
Just going to quickly jump in. I wonder, Simon, how do you determine whose feelings then matter? Arguably in, say, a sane liberal democracy like Australia, the neo-Nazi is actually probably one of our smallest minorities. They don't fit the narrative because they're idiots. But yeah, I guess how do we decide whose feelings matter?
It's the endless battle that comes from criminology, which is the government determines that. So what the government determines is a group that needs to be protected or thing, and that is the dangerous thing of it, but unfortunately that is the truth of it. And that's about as far as I can go, which is that the government decides which groups are the ones that can be, helped if they're hurt, and which ones are the ones that just get discarded if they hurt.
So I would posit two potential solutions to this problem, and one of them Simon's already really mentioned, which is the normative one. So basically, if we just look at it, I can't remember what it's called again, the window, it's like the aperture of political nicety, which once you're inside of that particular aperture, you're considered acceptable for discussion, or you're acceptable to be involved in discourse. And the thing is obviously that aperture moves, the window moves over the political spectrum, and at different times, people who historically looked like they were crazy right-wing turn out to just be, mild centrists as the aperture shifts towards Hitler taking control. By the way, Sam, it's Godwin's law. As soon as we mention Hitler, we've lost the argument. But the other thing I was going to say is that, basically, if we accept that and just look at society as an organic whole, then hate speech, or speech which is hateful, and we look at it as a normative framework, is only really useful as a mechanism of sustaining the status quo. The other way you could potentially look at whether or not speech, I suppose, is violent or violence, potentially could be in the sense of speech as violence towards your epistemic peers, like the idea that, and I think Sam already mentioned this, we should maybe only, if everyone is a genuine participant in the debate, as in they're actually there to talk, and this isn't just a mechanism of propaganda or them trying to force an opinion or use verbal subterfuge to slide something through, then we should engage with it and not consider it as a form of hate speech. And once again, though, there's some issues with regards to determining who is a genuine participant in debate. Sam?
Just it's a little off topic, but and well, ties in kind of. It just occurred to me then. I remembered seeing something on Q&A. If we have any international listeners, that's an Australian TV show on the national broadcaster, and they had Barnaby Joyce on there, and he made a comment on the fact that we need to have a broader discourse, especially on the ABC. We need to present a broader range of views. Blah, blah, blah. Even if it is, some of these more extreme right-wing views, they still have a right to be on the national platform. We then had a person come on who wanted to perform a song. They weren't allowed to perform the song. The ABC, they said they couldn't. But one of the central concepts of the song was "Fuck the Anzacs." And Barnaby Joyce became outraged and essentially said, how on earth could you possibly say that? And I think that really ties it in quite well. Is, from your view, you're more than happy to have more discourse when it reflects your worldview and less discourse when it doesn't. And I think it's a very difficult thing for people to say, yes, we should have more discourse, more speech, even if it doesn't reflect my views. Yeah, that's all I got.
Well, thank you, Sam. And I think actually this is probably a good point because we've talked a little bit about, speech as violence, and we've talked a little bit about the role of government. But I think something you wanted to talk about was how law can be used in a violent sense or be construed as violence.
Yeah, totally. The abuse of the legal proceedings, because everyone has a right to access the courts. I think in Australia there's actually maybe only 150 odd people that have been deemed to be vexatious litigants, who the court has essentially said, you're abusing the system, we won't involve you. But that's quite a few people considering the number of cases that take place. So I went into this looking up the abuse of the legal system, and I assumed, I guess it says a lot about my worldview, that it was going to be primarily corporations such as guns, I've got an example of that, or wealthy people like Clive Palmer abusing or Trump, this classic case of Trump just suing people into compliance, of essentially the wealthy abusing the legal system because they have the finances to do so. But after reading into it, I'm like, oh, holy crap, it is almost entirely domestic abuse. So, you have a couple, they separate. Unsurprisingly, in Australia, predominantly it's males perpetrating domestic violence, or at least statistically. And these men continue to pursue their ex-partner through the legal system. Because even if they have a domestic violence order against them, they can still be taken to court. So they do things like report child abuse, et cetera, et cetera. Like the list goes on, where these people essentially stalk them through the legal system. And because they have the right to access the legal system and bring complaints against someone else through the legal system, it's allowed. And so for this one, we're not going to find a solution to this, but what's your opinion on what the fuck can you do to prevent people from being able to abuse the legal system to continue to torture an ex-partner without hampering the legitimate right to access the legal system? Thoughts?
I think this is it's another one of those interesting line in the sand ones in terms of with regards to the violence in speech. And it sort of brings to mind the idea of, slightly different, proven innocent until guilty. In a court case, someone has a presumption of innocence. You don't have to prove that you're not guilty. And if someone already has a crime against them, although that can be used, I suppose, as part of their character, it can't necessarily be held specifically against them as just pure evidence that they conducted an act. So it is a difficult one in terms of providing protections to individuals and when and where you should be able to declare someone a vexatious litigant. And I would be interested to know what are the actual specific parameters in Australia, at least, in which someone can be declared a vexatious litigant. Does it have to be a judge decided, or is it like something a matter for the community through legal or through, for instance, political representation? Sam?
Two things. One, from what I could find, it's a judge. So the court can dictate that the person has become a vexatious litigant. They can appeal, and then it can move its way up like normal. Essentially, it's almost a charge against them, but delivered by the court. And interestingly, in these like this abuse of the legal system, especially in the domestic violence one, it's very common to use libel laws, because libel laws don't have the burden of proof. It's reversed. The onus of proof is on the defendant in libel laws. So it's really often that these people will essentially be forcing people to prove their innocence, which is just a bit extreme. Simon, you had some stuff?
So pretty much, I'd probably lean heavily on the concept when it comes to this sort of exploiting the legal system to be able to stalk your partner. The legal system in and of itself usually likes to, the instance you make a claim of a crime occurring, it actually goes into the court sort of thing, and the courts usually deal with it, but you're sort of dragged along with it. I feel like the easiest way to deal with it is if you sort of, at the minimized impact, I know this sounds weird, but you minimized interaction with the members that are involved in it, and you were able to just have that and go through the facts and whatnot, and you can gain that from two separate people at two separate times without either having to meet. And a lot of times outside of court, you can make that decision. And, in the minority of cases where that can't be happened, yes, the person will be dragged through, but that's going to probably be the minority of cases. So what actually should probably happen if we were going to try and minimize the amount of stalking through the legal system is making it so that pretty much prosecution and defense are the ones making the cases, and they're the ones that are interacting with their different parties to gain the information, because they're the ones that understand the legal jargon and whatnot and can actually make a fair case and almost have them argue it out on your behalf. Anyway, Tim?
I was just going to ask Simon, what about the right to represent oneself in a court of law? Seems like we'd be treading on another right there just by trying to solve that one.
By all means, if you want to argue it out with a defendant or a prosecution, which will probably be representing the party who doesn't particularly want to be involved, by all means, if they want to argue it out.
Oh, right. So you're saying in terms of like not even having the defendant necessarily in the court and maybe have them being represented by a stand-in, a champion, if we were going back to, medieval courts of law where you could fight to the death to prove your innocence or have someone do that on your behalf. Sam?
I guess it raises an interesting thing that took place in Queensland recently. So the Public Defence Organisation didn't pay its legal fees. So it has to pay money to the bar, right, in order to continue to have its license and its right to practice, blah, 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 because it's an organisation. It failed to pay them on time, so they were all temporarily disbarred. So for a period in time, in Queensland, there was literally no public defenders available for someone. So in this situation, Simon, this person would have to then be paying for their own lawyers if they weren't willing to go for a public defender. And I'm going to shoehorn in my next one, which is another side of the abuses. So John Ellis was allegedly abused by, I think, Cardinal Pell. I'm not entirely sure. Or, sorry, possibly a priest under Cardinal Pell's supervision. And so he took the church to court for damages. The final conclusion was that despite it having some of the benefits of a corporation, the church doesn't have all the responsibilities of a corporation. And so for instance, in my company, the CEO is the final call. If something goes wrong, the CEO is the one that pays. The court concluded the church wasn't the case. This wasn't the case in the church, and so the church was absolved. And what does the church turn around and do? It then sues this person for $750,000 worth of court costs. So you have this person that's already been harmed physically, allegedly, who is now being pursued for court costs because they attempted to rectify themselves. So the other side is, how do we now balance, if we have on one hand vexatious litigants abusing our system, how do we stop people being punitive against someone else? Well, I mean, the church spent the money, so does the church deserve the money back? Simon, you've got your hand up.
I realized I never actually put it down, but yeah, I can put my hat in the ring and get my head ripped off. This is the issue, because what you want is you want to have a system that, regardless of what background you come in with, when you come in, you know that there's going to be representation on both sides and that it's a two-way street. However, it can be exploited in the respect of, and this is where a lot of that element of what is I'm trying to think of the word, what is a reasonable expectation sort of falls on the court. And I feel like a lot of the time the court throws that back to whoever's being prosecuted. But in a lot of cases, the court has precedents to work this off. And I feel like that's something that needs to be leaned on a bit heavier. The issue comes with Queensland Court is that the High Court doesn't exist as such. They just have not the High... Okay. So not the High Court as in the High Court, but like as the two parts of the government, there is only the lower house. The upper house does not exist. Yeah, the upper house doesn't exist. And as such, that has a lot of interesting effects on presidents and how it's pushed through. But yes, that is the rambling response I have to that. The truth is that its fail-safe is also its greatest weakness when it comes to trying to get the courts to do what is considered the moral thing. So it just tries to do what is the word of the law and sometimes misses the spirit.
So maybe a bit more social, like if we are all held to a social and ethical standard, maybe the courts should, try and hold themselves up to an ethical standard as well. I've got probably one more example, or do you reckon we're running out of time, Tim?
No, let's crack on.
All right. So one more, which is guns. So if you're from Tasmania, you'll know guns. Logging. It ties in essentially where you've got the overlap of like political violence and legal violence taking place together. So guns took a bunch of people to court for $7.8 million, including Bob Brown and a bunch of other people from the Wilderness Society and stuff like that, right? Because they said, like, your protesting has caused me financial harm, right? So at what point, does a person have the right to express their political opinions through protest versus so, like, for instance, if I go out and say, it's my opinion that guns is causing deforestation, they're detriment to society, blah, 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 then could get sued for harming their reputation. It's sullied its reputation, caused loss to jobs and profits, which is what the defendants claimed in this case. Claimed the defendants did, sorry. However, like, this came out, and it's often called what's called a SLAP, which is double P, which is a strategic lawsuit against public participation. So essentially, it's using the court system to attempt to suppress public participation in debates. And like, logging is a incredibly contentious issue in Tasmania, and people arguably have the right to discuss it in public, even if that does have a negative impact on the companies themselves, because they operate in the public sphere. So surely people should be able to say their opinions of the companies. Tim?
I think this really does bounce back to the original issue of violence and speech. So I suppose when you live in a country where freedom of speech isn't necessarily protected by any bills, and you have only implied right to political speech, this is an issue. I mean, it's an issue even in countries that do have a Bill of Rights, e.g. America. But if speech is assailable at any particular point, obviously, if that's a political speech, if it's hate speech, or if it's speech in in this case, in a litigated and financial sense, like then it is going to be intercepted and attacked along a line of effort. So I suppose, companies and individuals are going to use every weapon that is made available to them. And so if we permit people to be sued for slander, libel, etc., then we are going to work in a form of an ability to suppress speech, or a chilling effect that can be achieved through the legal system. I suppose the question then is it worth having a system of financial recompense built in to protect those that might be unfairly slander through rumor, if we do recognize such slander as a form of violence? Do you guys think that's is there a balance to be struck, or do we have to go by the way of the libertarian and protect all speech regardless?
I would probably, if I had to pick a side to fall on, I would say, controversial opinion, I don't believe free speech in its central concept is actually that important. I think that a cohesive society is probably more important. Yes, you have the ability to say anything. I don't think that gives you the right to say anything, because say we'll take just a simple capitalistic approach. Why can company A put out ads that are blatant lies about company B? That's just direct, causing direct harm through falsehoods. If your product's truthfully superior, compete on the open market, right? So I don't think that free speech, unfettered free speech, is a positive in a society. Simon?
This is probably the most controversial kind of thing that I've heard, but I somewhat sit here to the root of what was being said. Somebody said freedom of speech, absolutely fine, but I don't think that means freedom from consequences. And I know that sort of undermines what the hell free speech is supposed to be, that you can say what you want without, somebody think. But I feel like there still has to be consequences, good or bad, for you still have that platform to say something. And you have that right to say something, but that does not mean that you have that right to be able to fly above what response will happen if you say that thing. Tim?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with this. I don't necessarily know what the answer is to this one. I suppose the issue I find with the response that is quite common, that freedom of speech does not equal freedom of consequences, is that green lights the ideas that you can achieve a chilling effect upon speech, and it's something that the journalists speak out about when they feel like they're being attacked in their vocation. And when it's coming from the other side in a political, cultural sense, it's seen as a facetious argument, as opposed to when it's on the right side, quote unquote. So for me, if you enable libel, slander, consequences due to speech, people getting lynched by the Twitter mob, which actually seems to not actually be as bad as many people are pointing out. There's a lot of people that have survived their Twitter deaths. Then you're going to these laws pertaining around speech as violence, or attempts to legislate or make politically unacceptable certain forms of speech, means that you essentially just end up with these laws as a mechanism for maintaining the status quo. Or if they're bent towards a particular side of politics, serving a certain political agenda. Simon?
Okay. So this is the case of where I cut a bit short, so I probably should have, So I meant an equal and opposite. So, for example, that means if I go, I believe that, we should go back to the White Australia policy, which I don't agree with, somebody has the right to go, no, that's not ideal. That is not a thing that we all agree with. Not. So I can't say that and go, oh, well, nobody can say anything bad about me. I have to say that and accept that somebody can equally say something free speech about my action. So it's free speech begetting free speech. So I can say it, but I have to understand that everybody else has their right to also say something back. And that's what I meant, the freedom from consequence sort of element. Not that freedom from consequence means that, somebody can lynch me in the streets. It means that they have the freedom to then in response say something about me.
100% agree with that one, Simon. And I'm sure that if a Freudian psychoanalyst was going to do a study of this particular video, that he'd come up with all of us as Nazis. Anyway, throwing to you though, Simon, you wanted to say something about violence, begetting violence, I believe.
Okay, guys, grip the wheel because we're about to do a right turn. So, as everybody's heard, the narrative for ages that, violent video games creates violence. So to break that down, we're going to go back to the study that sort of built off, which is the Bobo doll experiment, which was using children that saw parents acting with a particular doll that's called a Bobo doll, unsurprisingly. And if they were acting kindly, the children would act kindly. If they were act violently, the children would act violently. And it was this whole entire thing that, if they see it, then they're going to do it. However, it's also this really interesting thing of saying what is a symptom of violence and what is an alternate of violence. So the best way to describe this is if I go violent action, so I'm going to punch somebody. So the simple act, and I'm going, okay, that's not socially acceptable to do that, but I'm going to go out and I'm going to cut down a couple of trees. I know I'm going to get the Greens bashing me up because they're cutting down trees, but I cut down trees. And it's that argument of, by cutting down trees, do I become more violent because of those actions? Or is that an alternate angle, which I'm using my, inverted commas, violence to therefore, so am I offsetting that violence to a more productive thing? And that's where it comes to this sort of video game argument and becomes really difficult because a lot of these people that commit really violent crimes have to have an outlet. In a lot of cases, they might not have a perfect outlet. So they use video games as that outlet until they don't use video games as that outlet. And as such, they have commit a violent act. So the question is, do they doing the violent actions on the video games cause them to become more violent? Or is it that they are naturally more violent tendencies? However, they've had to sort of, in a lot of cases, have a crutch to sort of lessen those violent, I don't want to say urges. It's not violent urges, but like violent nature. No, not violent nature. So they're violent actions. So to try and make it socially acceptable. What do you guys think, about this argument?
So Simon, I would say, firstly, that I suppose violence and aggression and outlets. I think sports is a great example of this. So we can use the same aggression and tribal mentalities that come kind of partially wired into our systems and exploit them in different ways that don't necessarily lead to the same negative outcomes. Although, as you've kind of sort of mentioned, like a big part of this and which direction we take is going to have to do with our upbringing and our environment and how we interact with it. I suppose that was interesting in terms of when you're talking about people's enculturement. I'm trying to think of acculturation towards a particular, like whether or not they're violent towards something. Grossman's book on killing, he talks about this, like in his studies as a clinical psychologist and also as a army psychologist and an army lieutenant colonel, that by desensitizing individuals towards violence towards other humans, they were able to achieve greater effectiveness of the battlefield. So by using human targets rather than, the classical bullseye target, they were able to, inculcate or basically encourage their soldiers to actually shoot the enemy, which is actually something very hard to achieve because actually trying to deliberately kill someone is not something that, at least someone in a society which has not been inculcated towards committing interpersonal violence, is actually something pretty hard to achieve. So maybe, I think there is definitely something to be said potentially in terms of the, using acculturation as a mechanism of reducing violence, maybe exposure to violence, watching violence making us more violent. Maybe there is something to be said in terms of if you want to have a less violent society, intrapersonal violence shouldn't be something that be glorified. Although I would note as well that we've had increasing access to intrapersonally violent media over the past 30 years, and so which is pretty engaging, like video games, and yet we've seen a consistent decrease in violent crime in developed world. So I'm not really sure. Maybe we're all just bubbling away, ready to commit a mass genocide, civil war against each other. Sam?
I think it could be to do with your last point first. We'll go backwards. I'd say it's probably been, even if, say, violent video games and violent media, etc., lead to normalization of violence, and normalization of violence has definitely been shown to cause an increase in violence. It could also be that there's just been other societal changes, such as, increase in general standard of living, for instance, the removal of lead from petrol, the increase of access to abortion, blah, blah, blah. There's probably a whole lot of other things that have also, we live in a society. We live in a complex environment. So multiple factors are in play. So it could be that the negative effect of violent media has just been outweighed by another. I don't know. That's just putting thoughts out. And to go with you, Simon, I think that redirection of compulsions has been shown to be more effective. Like, if you respond to anger violently, it conditions you. Like, ultimately the way we work is we set down neural pathways. And the more we use those pathways, the stronger the pathways get. That's how rote learning actually works. If we respond to anger with aggression or violence, that pathway gets laid down harder. And so it becomes an easier response. Anger, violence, anger, violence, anger, violence. So in video games, I would guess, just to stick with them, they're not coming from a place of anger, so it may not actually be refreshing that pathway or reinforcing that pathway. But I do think that it's probably worthwhile avoiding violence where possible, because it would lead to more violence, at least the reinforcement. Tim, sorry?
An interesting thing I want to say then, if you're saying, like, maybe because video games and other violent media are associated with pleasure more than, anger, potentially increasing rates of people having access to media which is, engaging, arousing, exciting, but has a lot of violence, and that through very formative stages of people's lives. Simon, does this be potentially increasing rates of sadism?
Okay, well, yep, we've gone into sadism territory. So yes, I was sort of trying to do a horse or cart sort of scenario, and we've gone on to the sadism caused by video games. To be truthful, I don't actually know. I was just, as Sam was mentioning, the neural pathways. The other thing that sort of brought this up with this whole entire disengaging is seen as a modern coping mechanism that a lot of men use when they are in one of those situations, because society doesn't see aggression as a positive thing. And when the first few times they've committed aggression, they've seen negative outputs. So what they've learned is that's something to that's seen as got a negative label, and as such they try and avoid it as much as possible. And that's actually seen to be having like negative effects across the board when it comes to emotional engagement, because happiness and anger are on the same spectrum, but they're the same source. So if you're trying to subdue one, sometimes it subdues all. And also, it's seen that anger is also similarly related to when we have, emotional turmoil. And that's also been associated with, everything's always, linked when it comes to psychological literature, because they love to throw everything together. But they've seen that there's an uptick in, rural depression, because there's this whole entire thing that you can't show your emotions. And as such, a lot of arguments come back to this whole entire idea that anger is seen as this thing to avoid, and as such, trying to find outlets is the best way that we try modern adults that are, Sam, you want to say something?
Yes, I think you've hit on a brilliant note to wrap it up on. Like, suppression is not the right way, but neither is expression in terms of violence. Like, if you have an emotion that makes you want to be violent, suppressing that is not actually going to fix the problem. I think it's finding a way to express that emotion without violence. So we go back to, say, the point I raised earlier of transsexual people, whether or not we should perform surgery on them or whatever, right? There is a way that discourse can happen, in a caring and respecting way. You can understand the impacts your words have, so you can still have the conversation without causing the harm. Well, with the attempt to mitigate the harm, you can still have the emotion of anger without beating your wife or kicking your dog. It's expression is important. I think violence is not. I don't know.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. That's a nice little neat wrap-up. Thank you, everyone, for lifting in, and hope to hear from you next time.
This great warrior has left to his mighty Lord.